Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality.
Hi, and welcome to the first attempt at our Shattering Your Reality. This is Kate and Fahrusha coming your way on the air and up in the clouds. Tonight, we're honored to have as our guest Mr. Don Ecker. His background involves military, law enforcement, but most importantly, along with his wife Vicky, he established UFO Magazine. He is an intrepid UFO investigator, very well known, very well respected in the field, and tonight he is here with us to discuss our very mysterious satellite, the Moon. Fittingly, just yesterday morning, we experienced the blood moon. So, Don, thank you so much for being patient, for being with us, and welcome to Shattered Reality.
Well, thank you so much, and it's quite an honor to be your very first guest.
Well, it's all our honor.
Yes, we're very honored, and I have had a great interest. This is Fahrusha here. I've had a great interest in moon anomalies for a good long time now, and the one thing that has always struck me is something that I've heard you mention, and I've mentioned it on blogs and so forth. It has to do with the photographic collections that we are allowed to see of the moon, the stuff NASA puts up for us. And it's so far away and fuzzy, and you and I know that they send these probes up there, and they have cameras on them, and the cameras are great. And with the things down here, you can see a pimple on somebody's butt who's sunbathing on a rooftop in Manhattan. So what's up with that, Don? What do you think?
Well, it's quite simple, actually, Fahrusha. It's basically degrading of the photographs that have been. It's been an intentional act by either NASA or the powers that be that they degrade these photographs down to extremely low resolution for anybody's guess. Now, if I had to, for example, go into a court of law and swear to tell the truth, raise my hand to testify, I could not absolutely swear because I haven't yet seen the proof. Howsoever, what I have done over the years, I have interviewed, not only as a radio broadcaster myself, but I have interviewed lots of people from various walks of life that have been involved and interested in these types of items, and including a number of people that have seen the unedited lunar photographs.
Yeah.
That are available, providing you have a need to know. That's a very telling phrase that anybody that's been in intelligence operations or military operations will recognize. For example, back in 1995, I interviewed one of the most amazing people that I've ever interviewed in almost 24 years of broadcasting, a guy by the name of Vito Sicari, who was a petrochemical engineer. And during that show, we discussed his almost 3-week odyssey back in 1979, trying to get into Houston, NASA, with one of his company clients who had come up from Venezuela, that worked for a Venezuelan oil company that had a fascination with not only our Apollo missions to the moon, but a book that had been written by a science writer by the name of George Leonard called Somebody Else is on the Moon. Now, after 3 weeks of some unimaginable machinations that these two guys went through, they finally were allowed to see actual unedited NASA photographs, and they were astounded. Now, the company that was working in connection with Vito's company, okay, this engineer, wanted to purchase some of these photographs. So Vito's company purchased them for them. Probably 6 weeks later, they were sent, and they were all horribly, horribly degraded.
Oh, boy.
I mean, let's face it, we can shoot literally somebody's license plate on their car from thousands of miles in outer space. That is how sophisticated our satellite technology is. And the thought or the idea that the government, NASA, the military, or anybody would ever put up with this low-resolution stuff is beyond the pale. So they deliberately do it. Now, I speculate that the reason they do that is so, in fact, people will not be able to see some of these amazing lunar artifacts that are apparently sitting up there.
Yes, yes.
Well, why do you think they would have keep that to themselves?
Well, for actually the same reason that the UFO topic has been kept under wraps for at least 70 years now. They don't want this information out, because if this information became publicly known, and once again, I'm speculating, this would absolutely turn our world topsy-turvy. If suddenly the population of the planet Earth were aware that we, the human race, are not alone. Now, imagine how that news would be received in many, many nations around the world.
Don?
It would be frightening.
Don, suppose we're not just not alone, but we're not on top of the food chain.
Well, that's funny that you should mention that, because for several months I've been working on a paper. It's not done yet, but it's involved with something called the Harrison scenario. Now, basically what that is, back in 1958-59, the first SETI search by Professor Frank Drake was begun, okay, with zero results. But that was the launching point of our attempt to discover radio signals, intelligent signals throughout our known universe, primarily our galaxy, the Milky Way. And except for only a couple of anomalous signals that have been received, but they've never been repeated, okay, we have heard nothing out there. It's kind of like walking through a cemetery, just nothing but silence. Well, there could be a couple of reasons for that, ladies. Number one, nobody's out there. But I don't think anybody truly believes that.
No.
Number two, they have other technology other than radio signals that we haven't yet discovered how to tap into. Or there's another possibility that they are out there, but they're not broadcasting because they know something we don't. And what that something may be is that top of the food chain predator that you're alluding to. In other words, a civilization of some type that may be so xenophobic that when they discover an emerging civilization, perhaps they're looking down the road and saying, oh boy, a possible competitor, and they wipe them out. That's one of the scariest of all the possibilities of why we haven't heard anything.
Wow.
So you think there's been an actual threat made at high levels of government, and they think that rather than panic people, Although I don't think the threats could get a lot more serious than the real threats are today. I mean, we have enough problems without having, killer aliens.
Well, no, I'm not. I'm not necessarily suggesting that's what it is. But okay, just take this for a second and consider it. What if we suddenly were confronted with a 100% totally clean energy source that we could reproduce here on planet Earth? What would that do to the global community?
0 point energy?
Well, it could be anything. It doesn't matter.
Or even Tesla had it way back when. I mean,
well, yeah, but it's not available, is it?
No, not J.P. Morgan killed that one.
What would happen to the global oil conglomerates that basically surround the globe right now? They would be out of business overnight. You don't for 1 second think that anybody would let that happen, do you?
No, I don't. Which brings us to another question, about why we didn't go back to the moon, and what happened to the Chinese lunar probe, the little jade rabbit, and why didn't the Russians get up there after we went? Why the heck didn't we go back after we spent all that money, the millions and millions of dollars training those brave men and women to be astronauts, and the millions of tax dollars that went on those rocket launchers and the capsules and the rovers, the lunar rovers for the fellows to ride around in? What's your thought on that?
Okay, well, you ask a lot of questions there, and not only this hour, but I could talk to you for the next 3 or 4 hours about that.
That'd be fabulous, but I guess we can't do it.
Sure, I understand. This is something that I've been researching and studying since the early 1990s. And we didn't spend millions, Kate and Fahrusha. We spent billions.
Right.
And the Russians spent billions. And we both had casualties in that crazy race to the moon. And, number one, we got to ask ourselves first, what in the world were we trying to get there so quickly for? Now, that's a question that I have never heard anybody answer. We started the space race about 1962 with President Kennedy when he challenged the nation not only to beat the Soviet Union, who, remember, put the first satellite in orbit. They put the first human being in space. Okay, the Russians did it. And we were left in the dust, and a lot of people were totally freaked out about that. Did we lose our technological edge? Well, we showed that once we got rolling, we were truly a force to be reckoned with. But why did we have to get up there so quickly? Well, here's what some of my research has discovered. Number one, for over 400 years, astronomers, and I'm talking about world-class astronomers, were observing the moon, and they were seeing sights on the moon that were inexplicable and amazing. Okay? They were seeing, okay, this is not only with telescopes, but also with naked eyes, going back to the year 1541. Okay, now how do I know that? Well, NASA contracted out to an academic group during the Apollo race, okay, to do a study of lunar transient phenomena called NASA Technical Report TRR277, which I incidentally have a copy of. You can also see that online. It's also available online. But at any rate, they had been observing everything from lights in craters. They had been observing lights moving across the moon, they had observed what they called a clouding effect happening over many craters. Some of the craters continuously, off and on, for years, if not decades. And the British Royal Astronomical Society in the early 1870s had seen so many sights on the moon, and some of these sights, they claimed at the time, appeared like they were looking through their telescopes at a city from the sky.
Wow.
With the lights and everything. They observed that for over 3 years, okay? The British Royal Astronomical Society.
Amazing.
So NASA had to know that there were a lot of questions about that, and thus the race was started. Now, I'm presuming both you ladies were around in the 1960s.
Yes.
And you will recall all the promises that were being made, both implicit and explicitly. Promises of putting colonies on the moon, putting manufacturing sites on the moon, doing a lot of things. Well, we finally got up there in July of 1969. Now, that was almost immediately when low-key rumors started about what was actually discovered up there. And years later, after that, after the Apollo operation was totally shut down in December of 1972, with other missions scheduled to be launched,
Right.
Exactly.
with the rockets already built, the astronauts already trained, everything was paid for, NASA pulled the plug. Now, here's something else that you may or may not be aware of. When the first missions went to the moon, and believe me, when I first made this announcement about 20 years ago after I discovered it, and I ended up calling up NASA from UFO Magazine to make sure that I wasn't full of it, and they basically said, well, yeah, you're right. The first astronauts that went up there were armed. They carried weapons with them.
Yes, yes.
I didn't know that.
I do recall reading that.
What kind of weapons? So, I mean, what would you use in a...
Revolvers, I believe.
Well, I know, but
Don?
they wouldn't fire. You need...
No,
you
they
need
carried
oxygen.
they carried 45 caliber automatic pistols.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is, yes, that will shoot in a vacuum.
It will.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's not oxygen that fuels it. It's the propellant in the cartridge, which is a gas.
Oh, okay. Because I thought it almost like an explosive. I don't really know much about guns. So. As a matter of fact, I don't know anything about guns. Wow.
Yeah,
but why were they armed?
Yeah, I think that what's his name told me that the astronaut Edgar Mitchell mentioned that. Yes. Go ahead, Don. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we don't mean to interrupt you. You really
Sure.
startled me with that, though.
Yeah,
Armed.
it's true. And now when I called up NASA and I talked to the public spokesperson, I asked him, I said, why in the name of all that's holy would those guys have been carrying a weapon? And he said, well, we were afraid. Now, this, incidentally, and let me tell you this right up front, I didn't believe this guy for a second. Although he may have believed it. He may have been told that and he believed it. I didn't believe the story. That when they went up there, in case something happened when they were coming back, and their landing got screwed up and they landed in a jungle.
Oh, come on.
They wouldn't be unarmed. Well, here was the thing. Planet Earth is 75% water.
Right.
And if you remember when the moon shots were coming back, where did they land? They all landed in the ocean.
Right.
Okay, so that's why I thought this guy was trying to sell me a story. But here's why I think, once again, I got to tell you, I'm speculating that when they went up there, quite honestly, they did not know what they might find.
That's believable.
Yes.
Um, but wow, they oh that that that's just. But they would have had to have expected a target. I mean, there's no point in having a gun just to shoot it off. I mean, so and they would have expected a target that a gun would be effective against, or are they just guessing? I guess just guessing.
God only knows,
Yeah.
Fahrusha.
Yeah.
I honestly don't. I
Wow.
don't.
Wow.
But here's the other thing. Now, in my years of research on lunar phenomena,
Mm-hmm.
I found a number of photographs that were, to my eyes, shocking.
Mm-hmm.
And they definitely show what I believe them to be artificial artifacts on the moon. Now, if I'm correct, and if those photographs, which incidentally were all from NASA, these were all NASA photographs. If I'm correct that these showed an artificial construct, well, we certainly, to my knowledge, didn't have the capability to put some of the things up there that appear to be there. So what does that leave us with? Number one, here's one possibility. You know, this planet has been around for 4.5 billion years.
Right.
And the human race is I believe it to be much older than it's given credit for. But, hey, look, we cannot even agree on who killed President Kennedy, which now is 50 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't know. I mean, there's still a lot of controversy about that.
Fred
Well,
Chrisman?
Yeah. Yeah, so here's something to think about. Our history, our written history as we know it, goes back to about 3500 BC. Okay? Just a titch under 6,000 years.
Right.
That was the world's first civilization that we recognize, which was in Sumer, okay, the land of between the Euphrates and the in what is today Iraq, okay. But do we really believe that that is the earliest civilization? I do not.
Well, they found the stuff in Turkey, you know, that 10,000, 12,000-year-old civilization in Turkey.
Exactly.
Gölbekli Tepe, or
Yes.
Tepe, yes.
Yes, that is correct. But what about civilizations before that? And that, incidentally, was about the time of the cessation of the last ice age.
Mm-hmm.
Now, since that time, our world's oceans have risen in some places up to several hundred feet higher than what they were 15,000 years ago. Who knows what was submerged by that great deluge? Now, is it possible that there might have been an early human civilization that was very highly advanced that went to the moon? In other words, ancient human artifacts. That's one possibility. Now,
And India bears that out a little bit. You know, the Indian literature talks about another civilization, and there's some indication that there were nuclear weapons in that
Exactly.
Prehistoric Indian civilization.
Exactly. Exactly. You are absolutely correct. Now, what if there was another... boy, I'm sorry. That's my cell phone ringing.
That's okay.
What if, at some point in our past, another civilization from outside of our solar system came here, found Earth, and let's face it, this planet is hospitable to life, and for whatever reason set up an observing base on the moon that is no longer active? Or what if, this is another possibility, there are still ongoing activities there?
Well,
And that's, in fact, what was discovered by our Apollo mission. Now, here's something that, to kind of play into that I've always found curious. The Russians, back during that period of time, were prideful, if nothing else. And the fact that we got to the moon and they didn't never struck me as quite right. I would have thought that the Russians would have gone there just to prove that they could do it.
Yeah.
But they never did. They never did. Now, what the possibility may be, although you'd never get anybody to admit this, is that NASA was warned off the moon, and the warning was such that they relayed it to the Soviet Union, and the Russians knew better than to try to go up there at that period of time.
It certainly doesn't make any sense, Don, that they did not want to at least duplicate our feat and do something more. There is a rumor, which I think is not true, fallacious as it were, that Yuri Gagarin got to the moon. I don't think that's true, but there's a circulating rumor to that effect. And you do know that the Chinese had just recently put on that lunar probe, which was called Jade Rabbit.
Right.
And
it broke down.
Yeah. It saw some strange things, and they got really embarrassed about it. But now we haven't heard a word that they're going back. No sign of a rerun there.
Yeah, that doesn't sound likely either. Because obviously once you establish those programs, it's an enormous expense, but then to keep them going is not that great an expense. Most of the groundwork has been done. It's just
the science has been done.
Yeah, it's not inexpensive, but you would think that they would have followed that up. And then there was the other thing that Fahrusha was telling me about, that the time we fired rockets into the moon, and then it rang like a bell.
Yes, I was very upset by that at the time. It was at 2009. We had a probe going around the moon, and they decided to detonate a rocket towards, I believe it was the south pole of the moon.
They were looking for water,
so
actually.
they said.
Right.
But I can't see bombing something when you really aren't clear about what's there. If what we're given to believe is, we don't know quite what's there, and I think that is like, why would you bomb something just to bomb it, or to see if, isn't there a better way to see if there's water? Didn't the Indians go up there and discover that there was a little more water than we thought? They didn't bomb the moon. So I was really kind of upset by that, and I don't want to go into my experience involving that, which was a sort of a remote viewing experience. But since I did mention the remote viewing, you had mentioned to me that you had a meeting with Ingo Swan where he talked about his remote viewing experience, which was far more extensive than mine, and just wondered if you had anything to tell us about that.
Yeah, I met Ingo Swan, I guess it's been 15 or more years ago, when I was asked to give a talk back in Bordentown, New Jersey, by Mr. Pat Marcatilio.
Oh, God bless him.
Yes, God bless Pat.
And, I of course knew then who Ingo was, but I was really surprised when he traveled down from New York City to hear my lecture. And afterwards, we all, a number of people there, got together, and we were all talking and exchanging, contact information and what have you. And Ingo and I became at the time, we became very friendly. Now, after Vicki and I got back out here to the West Coast, about a year or 2 years later, Ingo, who had family out here, was coming out for a visit. And one of our mutual friends, Ingo asked this person if he would contact Vicki and I because he wanted to get together for dinner out here. And we said, sure, absolutely. So he came out here And we all met at an Italian restaurant in Burbank, a lovely little cafe. And we had about a 4.5, almost a 5-hour dinner party. And we got a chance to really get some in-depth talking done. Ingo really quizzed me on some of the things that I had been discovering in my lunar research. And I, of course, had a copy of his book, Penetration, had read it about 3 times, and I was dying to talk to him about his remote viewing experiment. Now, I'm sure, Fahrusha, you have both you ladies read Penetration?
I have not.
I have, certainly. Yes, I
Yeah.
have a copy of it right on my little laptop, and I keep it there.
Yeah. Well,
Perhaps some of the listeners really are. It's hard to believe, but maybe they're not familiar with Ingo Swan. So just that he is in a just not only he's sort of the remote viewer's remote viewer.
He was
and
one of the people who started the
established
remote
yeah.
viewing program out in Stanford, Stanford Research
Exactly,
Institute with Russell Targ and, oh, geez, the other fellow's name.
Scott.
No.
I'll put up.
Hal Puthoff, that's it. Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, Ingo Swan, and
Well, Ingo was the person that developed the protocols for the government's secret for 20 years remote viewing process, Stargate. We've all heard about Stargate.
absolutely.
And Stargate was put together by Swan. He was one of the most gifted psychics in the world. Okay, as a matter of fact, he could be almost scary.
Absolutely.
Okay? He could be almost scary. And what I really wanted to find out from him during that dinner party, and this was after a couple of bottles of red wine, okay, that we were all enjoying. And I asked him, now the person he identified in the book as Mr. Axelrod
Right, Mr. Axelrod.
was, and this is what Ingo told me, he was either in one of the deepest, blackest intelligence organizations ever, and he didn't know whether it was American, Russian, Chinese, God only knew, okay, what was behind them. Or, and when he told me this, he kind of shocked me. He said, or for all I knew, they could have been an ET outfit. So, I mean, take it for what it's worth. But basically, what these guys did is they asked him if he would conduct some remote viewing experiments. They wanted to hire him for $1,000 a day. And Ingo smoked cigars, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And they promised him all the cigars he needed at this place. So they picked him up. They put a hood over his head. They took him to God knows where, to this, what appeared to be, according to Ingo, an underground facility. They put him up for several days, and they went in, conducted the remote viewing protocols, and Ingo started remote viewing. Now, at the time, he had no idea what he was remotely viewing. But as he proceeded, he said, it suddenly became clear that wherever he was, it wasn't on planet Earth. Finally figured out that he was remotely viewing a spot on our moon. And what shocked him was that he was remotely viewing what looked like an area that was covered by some type of either shield or force field or something along those lines, with banks of light in there, with a very pronounced greenish hue, and he saw people that were almost semi-naked working in the lunar dust, doing God only knows what. That part was great, but what freaked him out, and I mean really, he almost had a meltdown, was when they suddenly realized that he was looking at them, and they turned around and looked at him back.
Yeah.
And that blew him literally out of that remote viewing session.
Mm-hmm.
And for some time after that, he was truly terrified that they were going to come somehow, psychically, I suppose, and scramble his mind. He was terrified of that.
Don,
Yes.
I want to make one point here. As a person who has extensively studied remote viewing myself, and there is something that happens when you get into a deep remote view. If it's going really well, it can go to the point where it's no longer a remote view. It becomes an astral projection. And when it becomes an astral projection, you're actually putting part of yourself there rather than viewing something. And strangely, when when I viewed the moon, I wasn't trying to view the moon. I was doing a meditation, and I went to the moon, and something rather similar but a lot less dramatic happened to me. And it can happen in a remote view if you put yourself too much into it, it becomes what, for lack of a better term, would be an astral projection.
Well, I got to tell you, I found that rendition he gave me to be so fascinating. But wait, there's more.
Oh no! Why?
Ingo had. I'm sorry.
No. I was just going to say, why did he feel so threatened? What was there about the glamps? Just that it was a different being, and it was sort of like a xenophobia, or was there an actual threat that he sort of psychically felt?
Yeah, according to him, there was.
There was.
He was
Okay.
an intruder.
So
He was intruding.
okay. So it wasn't just that they happened to see him back. I mean, there was an actual feeling of threat.
Yeah,
Wow.
he detected, according to what he told me, he detected first surprise
Mm-hmm.
and then anger
Whoa.
from what he was watching.
Whoa.
I want to make one other point here, just as an experiencer, that when you're having this sort of an experience, not as necessarily as a remote viewer, but in the face of some form of alien intelligence, for lack of a better term, what transpires is some form of raw biologic terror that is within your body. It's not like being afraid that that you'll fall off the cliff, or you came near to a car accident and you have fear. The kind of thing that happens, and has happened to me, and I've spoken to other experiencers, there is a kind of raw terror that nothing else duplicates. So I'll leave that, and please go on. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I did want to say that.
Well,
No, that's fine.
And really, Ingo Swan did not seem like a man to be intimidated either, which is why it always intrigued me that he felt so threatened. But I'm sorry, I interrupted too. Now, when we left you, you were saying, "Wait, there's more."
There's more.
Yeah.
So, so what more is there? I mean, that's pretty good right there.
So on one of Ingo's trips out here to the West Coast, he was going to have, now he was a gourmet cook, all right, and he was going to have dinner with some friends down in Santa Monica. And so he was going out to do some shopping for the ingredients that he needed. And he went to this supermarket. Now, one thing, in order for me to, for everybody to get the sense of what was transpiring, I got to mention that man, Mr. Axelrod, this mysterious, apparently intelligence official, okay, that Ingo had contact with a number of times, had a couple of guys that worked for him. And Fahrusha, you'll recall this from the book,
Yes.
that Ingo referred to as the twins.
Yes.
Now, these were two guys who were probably not brothers, but they were very similar in manner, physique, build, what have you. In other words, they were a couple of bruisers, according to Ingo, or could be if the situation called for it. But he went to this supermarket, and as he's walking in, he recounted this story. He was walking down to the vegetable section, and suddenly he was confronted with one of the most breathtakingly sexual women he ever saw in his life. And he described her in the book as wearing a pair of really skin-tight short shorts. Over her ample bosom, she had, from what I recall, a scarf wrapped around that. It was not an actual halter top. Was wearing these outlandish purple sunglasses, had a mane of hair that I guess, you know, if you're a heterosexual guy, you want to run your fingers through it. And he was literally knocked back on his heels by this woman. And he was so taken with her that he had to walk down to get closer to her. And as he's walking down, the hair on the back of his neck started to tingle. Now, like I said, Ingo was one of the most gifted psychics around anywhere for many, many years, and it suddenly hit him. This is what, and this is what he said in the book, and this is what he told me personally. He said, I suddenly realized that that woman was not a human being.
Mm-hmm.
She was an ET. But then he had a bigger shock. As he stopped himself and he realized that this woman, who he now was convinced was not human, might detect him, he's looking around for an escape to get out of there, and he sees one of these two guys from Mr. Axelrod.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not going to go that way, so he starts to go another way, and there's the other guy, and they both apparently have this woman. They're observing her, or they must have been following her or something. Well, that shook him up so bad, he just got the heck out of there, okay? Jumped in his car and went somewhere else. Well, a few days later, he gets one of these mysterious phone calls that he has to go. Let's see, I believe he had his apartment, Fahrusha, you may know this better than I, in Greenwich Village, is
Yes,
that correct?
in the West Village. I believe it was on Lower 7th Avenue, 7th Avenue South, but I couldn't attest to that absolutely. But it was in the West Village, yes.
Well, he had a code set up. Whenever Mr. Axelrod wanted to get in touch with him, he would either get a note or would get a quick phone call, go to so-and-so, and he would go down to a payphone and then stand there and wait for the phone to ring. Well, he got one of those notes, or however they contacted him, but he knew he had to get out to a payphone that had been pre-selected. He went to this payphone, and sure enough, the phone rang. He answered it. There was a woman on the other end and said, "Hold for a moment, please." And the next voice he heard was Mr. Axelrod, demanding to know what in the world he was doing in that store where that woman was. And then he told him, he said, "Well, just so you know, if you ever run into her again, stay away from her because she's as dangerous as you can imagine." So that was just another one of these little weird, these weird little anecdotes that keep this field so interesting.
Yes, indeed it is. Yes, indeed it is.
So, but sort of to get back to the moon a little bit too. So this fellow really did feel that there were bases on the moon. In essence, I mean, some of the certainly the early astronauts felt the same thing. Edgar Mitchell is very definite about saying that aliens not only exist, which most of us would take for granted, but actually are here. And he's a man whose word I take. So again, I mean, almost, follow the money trail. Everything comes down to money, and oil is certainly a huge producer of money. But I can't believe that that's all that there is. I mean, I would like to think that there was something other than just strictly wealth that would be behind all this. I
What if we're being quarantined?
Well, I would go along with that. What I agree with even more is that your theory that there were much, much earlier human development on this planet that probably destroyed themselves or met with a horrible fate, and that the moon may just be left over from them, or perhaps there are still some survivors out there. But everybody seems to feel that if suddenly the presence of aliens are known, that everything's going to fall apart, and religions are going to come apart at the seams, and governments are going to run for the hills. And I honestly don't think that's true. I think, maybe a la Spielberg, we've been so prepared for so long now.
Well, we may be, but we're a first world country.
Ah, okay.
Let's look at some of the other countries around the world.
That's true.
And there is the rub, as say. But, there was something else about the moon, too, that I wanted to mention when we were speaking about this tonight. We stopped going to the moon in 1972. And a lot of people were curious about that. I certainly was one of them. But what I found even more curious, and nay, let me say it, inexplicable, was, do you know that we went back to the moon in the early 90s?
No.
With people?
We did. We went back to the moon, and not only went back to the moon, we completely, totally rephotographed the entire moon with what was then cutting-edge technology. The project was called Clementine.
Right, yes.
And it
yes.
was not a NASA project, ladies. It was a Department of Defense
Yes, it was.
project. And I have a very good friend, Dr. John Brandenburg, who I've viewed many times. Dr. Brandenburg was the administrative assistant to the director of the Clementine project. And John and I have talked about this many times, both on the air as well as off the air. And here's a little factoid that you may find absolutely astounding. They took over 2 million photographs. How many of those photos have you ever seen?
Nada.
None.
And even when they were coming back in real time during the Clementine mission, even though they were coming back, John and the rest of the people in the support group saw practically none of them. They had a contractor, a DOD defense contractor in there that was getting all of those photographs, and they were keeping them under wraps. And I asked him about that. And I said, John, what in the world were they doing? He said, Don, and I mean, he's gone on the record with this. He said they were looking he said, I believe they were looking for changes up there, and they were looking for specific things. I said, what kind of specific things? He said, well, use your imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he also speculated that there was a nuclear war on Mars, which I found fascinating.
No, a nuclear detonation, not necessarily.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he did. He proved it, as a matter of
fact.
Yes.
And that got buried. I mean, you would think that...
Life and Death on Mars, the New Mars Synthesis.
Yeah.
Was the book that he wrote about it.
Absolutely. And yet, it doesn't get published in journals like Science or Nature. And I mean, certainly the man academically is more than qualified for a peer review. He backed up that so-called theory with absolute facts, and it just gets buried. Who, who's the censor through all this?
And another thing is that at NASA, we have here a number of people, from astronauts like Edgar Mitchell to this gentleman, Dr. Brandenburg, to Maurice Chatelain, to Paul Hill, who you've mentioned on your show quite a bit, and
Sure.
And other individuals whose names unfortunately escape me at this very second, but there's got to be a dozen of them, including astronauts and ground control and people of that nature, who have not exactly defected, but you would say they have come clean and said a few things that give us to believe that what you see is not what you get up there.
Well, why? Yeah, great question. Why in the world is it still such a secret? Why are nobody? Why is no one up in arms about this? I mean, well, good Lord. You had mentioned earlier, look at the state of the world today. We are in a genuine, deeply, and I might add, a cesspool right now. It is just, it's just horrible. When I get up in the morning, I almost hesitate to turn on the radio when I have my first cup of coffee. And there's so much bad news. I mean, the most recent, this Ebola scare that is going on. And but you got to ask yourself, in the powers that be currently, where do any of these items that we're talking about tonight fall on their scale of things to be addressed? Well, it's got to be beneath the floorboards. UFOs, things on the moon, extraterrestrial intelligence, and that's where it's going to stay until such time as it doesn't stay there. Now, why is that? Well, this is something else that I have looked at over the years. Go back to 1953, particularly January of 1953, which was about 6 months after the infamous Washington, D.C. overflights that happened in 3 weekends in July and early August of UFOs, something, unidentified objects, that overflew the nation's capital with total impunity. Okay? Whatever it was, went in airspace over the Capitol, over the Pentagon, over the White House. Jets were called in. They couldn't catch them. These things flew around. As a matter of fact, you mentioned Paul Hill, who at that time was a high-level employee of NACA, which was the precursor to NASA, okay, NACA, which was later what NASA became, although at the time they weren't as concerned with outer space. But he had a tremendous sighting in Washington, or on the outskirts of Washington, during these overflights. Went back, talked to his people at NACA, and they told him that if he ever mentioned it publicly, he'd be fired.
Yeah.
So sure, they knew something. They knew something was going on, but it had them scared to death. Well, in January, the government finally said, okay, look, we got to figure out a way to handle this. And that's where we got what became known as the Robertson Panel. They brought in some of the top scientific talent in the United States at that time for a week to discuss UFOs, and not what are they, where do they come from, what do they want. No, that isn't what they discussed. It's how do we handle it? And they decided upon, and I'm just giving you the short version, ridicule. Ridicule is the best way to do it. And if you look at the history of the phenomena from that point forward, that's exactly what the United States government and the military and the intelligence agencies have done for the next 60 years.
Ridicule.
Yep, the giggle factor.
Yes, indeed.
But Don, too, knowledge is power. And I think a lot of these people in authoritative positions like having this knowledge to themselves. It just makes them feel a little bit more important. Like, we can handle this, but you schmoes can't. And that's how it's going to be. I think I have to agree with you. I mean, today's crises so outweigh any discussion of UFOs. And I think you even see it like in the media and in talk shows such as this. It seems to have dropped off a little bit. I think people are so concerned with just staying alive these days that something is, interesting, but how would you say, just not really part of their daily life. That, as you say, takes the back burner for sure.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And let's face it, in the last 10 to 15 years, the level of research into this phenomena and the people that are so-called researchers, it has just degraded into absolutely a mishmash of garbage out there.
Yes, it has. And
20 years ago, we had people like, at the time, Bruce Maccabee, Stanton Friedman, Kevin Randall,
Richard Dolan.
Dolan, no, nobody even knew who Dolan was.
Oh,
then.
That's true. That is true.
Okay, but then you had people like my wife Vicki and I.
Yes.
With the magazine. I mean, we were concerned with doing actual research, getting out in the field, interviewing people, going to places where things have happened, talking to neighbors, and you know what I'm saying, conducting an investigation. And that doesn't happen today. If a kid, and a lot of them today are kids, if they have a laptop computer and they're sitting down in mom's basement with an internet hookup, they can call themselves a UFO researcher, go on the web, find a case, and then just start blabbering about it.
Yes.
And that's research today.
Well, unfortunately, MUFON hasn't been, totally transparent in doing their job. Some of the people are wonderful people and they do their job, but they're not really releasing the cases so people can see them. And that's an issue too, another issue.
That was true 30 years ago.
But bringing it back to the moon for a last question, Don, there was a discovery very recently having to do with a geologically huge, big as like a half the moon, square artifact that was discovered. And I know that some of the rocks on the moon are older than the Earth, and the soil is older than the Earth's soil. So do you have any opinion? Have you seen this research? It's really very new, and no one would blame you if you hadn't seen it, but about this square artifact that has been discovered by scientists on the moon?
I hate to admit this, but I try to be an honest guy. No, I hadn't heard of it.
Well, I'm going to send you it on the internet. I'll send you an email with it. But it's just this huge geological thing that there's this big square, that is not like the rest of the moon, and it's a big, huge square that the astrogeologists, I guess they would call themselves. And they have discovered this, and they are making theories now as to what it might be. Of course, that the things they're coming up with are purely speculative, and they really don't know.
But there's so much about the moon you don't know. Like one astronomer said, "Oh, the moon? No, it does not exist, because it shouldn't exist. I mean, the characteristics and so on, the orbit, the size, the double planet thing." the rotation that matches this, the fact it's kept this planet's climate stable long enough for life to develop. I mean, so many weird things. And they keep finding them, the mascons and all those massive.
Almost like a plan, huh?
Yeah. I honestly, I think there are some artificial satellites. I think the moon's one, Phobos is another. Probably when we get out to Jupiter and Saturn and so on, I think they have been planted here. And somebody knew what they were doing, and they knew how to stabilize life forms on various planets. And once it gets a massive rock in the Goldilocks zone, they go, oh, we'll put another rock out there. Everything will be peachy keen. Before you know it, they'll have an atmosphere, rain, oceans, water, everything. It sounds almost like too kumbaya to be true, right?
Yes, indeed. That's really true, Kate. I am wondering whether we should give Don an opportunity to, talk himself up and what he's doing and talk about his
please, Don,
his
I'm sorry.
show.
My manners are showing. Fahrusha is absolutely correct. Please. What are you up to?
Yeah, right now primarily what I'm up to is my radio program. It's called Dark Matters Radio. It's carried on the Cyberstation USA network out of Boston, Massachusetts. Believe it or not now, this has been, although I haven't been 10 years with Cyberstation, this is the 10th year of Dark Matters Radio.
Bravo.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We run Monday through Friday, starting at 10 p.m. Pacific time. That's 1 a.m. on the East Coast, so it's kind of late for all you folks back east. But the good news is that all of those shows are available for either streaming online or a free download. We do not charge anybody for that. And, it runs Monday through Friday, and, I've been having a heck of a good time doing it for as long as I have.
And I'm a fan.
Well, thank you.
And Fahrusha was telling me you have a book coming out. Is that so?
No, I have a novel that was published.
Yes.
Oh,
That's
okay.
what it is.
I'm working on a sequel. The novel is titled Past Sins. It's a horror novel.
Oh.
And, boy, I'll tell you, especially this time of the year is a great time for it. Halloween is coming up.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
But
I heard you read part of it on the air, and it was very impressive.
oh, thank you. That's been a while ago. Good Lord. But, Past Sins is it took care of I had a Jones good horror, and I've always been especially fond of vampire stories. And that's what this novel is about. What if vampires were real? What if there were creatures called vampires and the Central Intelligence Agency got their hands on one?
Oh, boy.
Oh, Don, please.
You're scaring Miss Kate Valentine. She's trembling here.
Oh, no. CIA, I mean, they're bad enough. Now they have vampires, too.
Oh, boy. Now imagine what they could do with a real vampire, huh?
Oh, please. Anyway.
Very scary. So, I want to thank you so much for coming on with us, and we're going to, hope that you'll come back. We hope that this podcast that we're working on here, this Shattered Reality, we're hoping to get it going, and that we get a bunch of good people on, and we couldn't get anybody better than you, Don. And
well,
I have really, you were talking about remote viewers, and when I think of you, I also think of the other great remote viewer, because I think that, I trust you in a way, because I think you've got that, that police ESP like Pat Price had, who was the greatest remote viewer of our time. I think even better than Ingo on a certain level. And unfortunately, he was snuffed by one of the governments, and we never know who. But he was a wonderful police detective, and I really believe that you fellas, a lot of times you have that little extra sense that lets you know what to do and what not to do, and you see things that other people don't see. So I want to thank you very much, and we're going to end the broadcast this tonight with my surmisings, and we'll certainly let you listen to it. My surmisings are things that they're not exactly predictions. They're things that just figure to me. And as Russell Targ said about UFOs, something like that is true. So I'm going to say something like what I'm going to say is true. And my surmising for this evening is that some government, maybe the U.S. government, maybe the Chinese government, maybe some other government, is developing what is essentially a suicide machine. And we've all heard in books like The Men Who Stare at Goats, we've all heard that there are certain psyops things going on. And I think somewhere in somebody's deep black program is a suicide machine. And it probably works through some form of sound waves going out, taking it out, putting it somewhere where there is a population where they don't want the people to be there anymore. And these people will, in fact, commit suicide. I don't know when we're going to find out about it. I don't know how it's going to happen, but that's my surmising for tonight. And with that, Kate, you want to say?
Yeah, well, that was sort of a grim note, but I guess we're all dying to find out. Huh? Anyway, Don, listen, I've just really admired you from afar for so long. UFO Magazine, God, when that came out, every issue, I go, yeah, here it is again, and go from the beginning right to the end. And it's really been a real pleasure to speak to you, and you are one of the greats in the field. And I thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Well, thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure. And thank you for the honor of being the first guest on your new radio program. And hey, let me tell you, and this is something I don't talk about often, but you're right. I do have a sixth sense that works pretty good occasionally, and I got good feelings about where you ladies are going to be heading with this.
Well, wow, thank you.
Thank you.
That's very, very encouraging. And I think we'll let it go on that high note.
Yeah, on that high note. and the honor is all ours.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Absolutely, Don. Thank you again. Thanks so much.
Bye
You
now.
bet.
Okay, bye-bye.